Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon, and today I have a wonderful guest. This is Darante, who runs his own YouTube channel. He's been online for about 3 years now, and I love his perspective because he is an ex-pastor, and I think that you can't get any more inside than that. So, Darante, welcome to the channel.
Hey, man, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today.
Me too. I've been diving in and love your videos, been going through them. First of all, I think you have a wonderful mission in what you're doing, and I'd like to have you speak on that in a minute. But first, to kind of introduce what we're talking about a video you did 3 weeks ago. It was 10 secrets pastors don't want you to know about church specifically. And those 10 could each be their own video, their own talking point we could dive into for a long time. I don't know how you succinctly cover them in your 11 or 12 minute video that you did. I'm hoping that we can dig a little deeper today. But yeah, very happy to be talking about this conversation. And maybe before we dive into those 10 secrets, just give us two things: a little bit about your background as a pastor and a little bit about your mission now and what you're trying to accomplish.
Absolutely. I spent nearly 2 decades in active ministry and started off at a very young age, around 11 years old. I got filled with the Spirit of God with the evidence of speaking in tongues in a very dramatic fashion. And after that, was really on fire for Jesus. And so I got involved in youth ministry, campus ministry at schools, eventually worship ministry. I was a worship pastor for years. And then finally, I was an associate pastor, an executive pastor. I've been chief ministry officer at churches. And then I actually launched 2 churches. Started the first one in Jacksonville, Florida, and the second one in Dothan, Alabama, which is my hometown. My journey through ministry was very interesting. I often tell people I feel like I was deconstructing the whole time. Because it seemed like every phase or so, I was finding something else that I no longer believed in, or that I no longer had an attachment to as other people did, which I think a lot of believers do. And in my mind, it wasn't deconstructing. In my mind, it was getting, seeing through those glasses dimly and getting a better view of Christ. It was not leaning into my own understanding, and it was my attempt to get closer. And so, which served me well throughout that process. So as a pastor, I noticed, especially when I look back, because my wife will point out, which she's my current wife now, we weren't married when I was a pastor, but she'll point out when she listens to those later years that I don't sound like a Christian when I'm preaching. And that's because I had departed so much from tradition, trying my best to have an honest relationship with my faith. And the more honest that relationship became, I eventually in 2014 was sitting in my car, realizing that, I don't actually believe in a God. And if I did, if I believed in this God, there's no way I'd be serving it. I'd absolutely be trying to assemble the Avengers to take this one down. This is a Thanos level threat at this moment,
For sure.
And so it was, it was sort of an epiphany, and it was actually like a sigh of relief, because then I realized, like, okay, so it's not demons, it's not angels, it's not God, it's not some divine purpose. It's, at the end of the day, is circumstances and math. There are certain things. My life is the result of these consequences, and my own inaction in many ways, because I've been so dependent on God. And that's when, because what was leading me to this thought, and I'll wrap this up, what was leading me to these type of thoughts is that the work I'm doing is actually not helpful. I'm preaching some good stuff. And I was doing my best to infuse my sermons with sociology and psychology. And it was some really profound stuff. But in the middle of that, I'd also say stuff like, don't you try to figure it out. God is already working it out. Or sure. God's grace will never lead, God will never lead you, whereas grace will not protect you, which that ain't even biblical, because he led the apostles and they all end up dead. So I don't understand where the people are getting this from. But I realized that it wasn't just that the message wasn't true. It became that, this message is actually harmful to human agency. It's harmful to human authenticity. And that's when I realized, I can no longer be a pastor. And so for the next decade, from 2014 to last year, I started wrestling with, number one, who am I now? How much of me is me, and how much of me belonged to this, idea that I was a part of? And what do I do with all of this training and community development, all of this training and pastoring and just building conversations and content around people. What do I do with all of this now? My first thought was to eventually tell people that, hey, everything you believe is absolutely foolishness, and here's all the reasons why. And I did that for a few months, and what I watched was once I did that, is people wrestle with everything they were going to lose after that. So I grew up as pretty much as an orphan, so I don't have a lot of attachments the way that other people do. So that wasn't a cost that I counted for other folk. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And then once I watched that, other people were like, oh, for them, it's not just, making up their mind and doing something different. They might lose relationships with people that they really love. They have this weekly routine that they're a part of. That's a part of their personal development journey. And now they won't have that anymore. And so I pulled back because I realized, like, man, I'm taking something away from these people and not giving them anything in replacement. So I waited 10 years to just kind of research, kind of study, and then just kind of wrestle with myself as far as because there's a lot of implications for me as an atheist now for doing anything that even looks like pastoring, or doing anything that even looks like preaching. I felt weird the first time I started getting patrons, because I'm like, oh, are these offerings? Like, what do I do with this? And so I've had to recalibrate myself and make sure that, whatever it is that I'm doing with the next few years of my life, that I have an understanding of it. And so I know I do. And I think what it is just to help build community. Churches become in our kind of cultural zeitgeist, the center stone of community. But that's never what it has been, and it's never been the only thing that can do that. But in Western culture, it's permeated our ideology so much. We're afraid to gather and do things that look like church without calling it church. And so I'm throwing myself out there to try to build something that actually has some tangible meaning and some tangible impact. I'm also severely concerned about the amount of people who do deconvert and suffer with horrendous religious trauma, mental health issues, anxiety, because we've completely ripped them from any form of social ecosystem without being attentive to rebuild something, And so that's my little experiment right now. I'm experimenting with building community beyond superstition. I definitely think we need more of it, and I'm gonna do my best to play a major role in that.
I love it, man. Seriously, it's something that I think is a common theme. I've only had a few of these conversations so far on my channel, but I think in every single one of the things that has come up is the need for community, the need for what is next.
Yes.
It's easy to deconstruct. It's not easy. It's awfully hard to deconstruct, but it's easy to go through a process in general. What's hard is rebuilding afterwards.
Yes.
And yeah, when your whole life, especially for those that grow up in it or indoctrinated into it, it becomes the challenge is, okay, what now? What next? What does this mean? You have to answer every question. You have to redefine every term. You have to figure out if morality is objective or subjective, what your call is, if you have meaning, all of it. It's terrifying. And you're right to recognize that a lot of people have it harder than other people, just whether it's their background or their personality type. And I feel for that. So I love what you're doing. That's what I meant by mission. I wanted it to come from your mouth that a community is the goal, and I echo that. So I think our conversation today will be excellent because of that, because we're talking about the community that people are in, that they lose when they leave faith, that then we need to help rebuild, and that community that they're in that looks so pretty, that is religion's big claim to fame. If nothing else, this is what we have. We give people purpose and community and people and encouragement and accountability, but I think it's not that pretty, and you have the inside track. So let's talk about this. Your 10 secrets pastors don't want you to know about church, and the first one is that church is a business. So kick it off for us. Explain what you mean by that.
Many people, when they think of church, they think of it just as a place that is just a spiritual center. It's a place of worship. It's a place of prayer, but they're absolutely, whether you're talking about the more traditional ecclesiastical churches, or you're talking about the more congregational, non-denominational churches, or even the self-started, pastor churches, All of these churches run exactly like businesses. Now, the people who are leading those churches, that's not lost on them. They know that we have the accountant. We got to do some reporting. Churches do get some slack in their reporting, but we got to do some reporting. And then, of course, we have to make sure that people are getting paid. We have to make sure that that the bills are being paid and stuff like that. All right, which is fine. But for many, and that shows you where the problem is, there's a large segment of believers who are shocked by that. There's a large segment of believers who are shocked by hearing that, oh, snap. So when my pastor gets up and asks me for that offering and tells me that he's doing this because this is what God wants us to do, that's not actually the case. He could literally just get up and say, hey guys, if y'all still want, electricity next week, this is why we need this money. But I wonder if that conversation would go over differently if he said it that way, which that brings me to the people who wouldn't find it controversial, who say, no, I know this. That's common sense. Churches need money to operate. They gotta have the money. Yes, thank you for admitting that, because you're admitting two things in that. Number one, that God does not provide. So we can start right there. If churches need the exact same thing that every other business needs in order to work, if churches need startup capital, and that startup capital has to come from the people, then there's really no need for God there. And I say, okay, that's low-hanging fruit, but it actually gets me where I really want to go with this one. The problem isn't that churches operate like businesses. The problem is that they're dishonest about it. The problem is that they get up and they say, I need you to give because if you give, God will give you more money. I need you to give because if you give, God will cover your son. Or if you do not give to this church, then you will be cursed. If you do not give to this church. See, now when you combine that language with the reality that that's not where this is coming from. This isn't a God thing. You just need more money. And in an honest case, you just need more money to keep the church afloat. In a dishonest case, you need more money for your new Jag or your new Cadillac or your new shoes. And the sad thing is, if church were honest about it being a business, we'd all realize how bad of a business it actually is. And that's probably the biggest crime here, because then if it is a business, then every member there is an investor. And those members have to start asking themselves, what's the return on my investment? I've been giving in this church for years. Some people have been a part of churches for generations and can barely get help, if somebody, dies. As I pointed out, even with the mega churches, the pastors and mega churches, what many people don't know, many of those pastors don't take a salary. Okay, I said the nice thing about them. It's because their churches have already made them rich. Yeah. Their notoriety has already made them rich.
For sure. They're making millions on their book deals. They don't need Yeah.
And then what they're not doing is taking those lawyers, those accountants, those publishers, those ghostwriters, and making them available to the very church who gave them access to all of that. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Because they're not being honest about it being a business. They can just say, God did this for me,
Yeah. I think a caveat that, and I'm sure you would agree with, but before we get too much pushback, is that, of course, there are healthier churches.
Yes.
And not every church is a mega church.
That's
and
right.
There are churches where you have a pastor that lives below their means, etc. I did an episode where I did a deep dive into churches, and a lot of the information I found was damning and was unbelievably, like, even if there's a few churches that claim to be hearing from the Holy Spirit, this kind of corruption simply should not exist within Christianity. There shouldn't be any Christian congregants of groups of 20 or more that can sit there praying, reading the same word of God, hearing this kind of thing and not feeling convicted of it. So the fact that we know there's truly millions of people involved in churches like this, I think, doesn't give you the free pass you want to point to some of the good churches. But
absolutely,
yes, we recognize they are out there. What would you say in terms of, if you were, I don't know if this is fair, but obviously if we were trying to make like broad assumption categories, even the churches that are being good stewards of the money as best they can, what are still the things that are always going to be an issue when church is a business like this?
The biggest reason that churches are supposed to have this tax exemption, right? And that is to protect there being any benefit to one individual person, or protect for there to be any benefit to shareholders. The idea of having a nonprofit is not that it can't have revenue. It's not that it can't operate like a business. is that it can't benefit from its revenue. The shareholders, the people, or not shareholders, but you get it, the corporate members, they can't benefit from those, in any direct way. Everything has to be poured back into the mission, right? That becomes the first danger, is that's really hard to govern, especially in a case where churches do not have the oversight that other organizations have. And it becomes even more dangerous, even in the well-meaning churches, because it's not the extravagance that's the problem. I mean, the extravagance is problematic. It's the language itself. It's the belief itself. You get to the place then, how do you determine who's qualified to make the financial decisions? How does that decision get made? If the belief is, if this is connected with my superstitious ideology. And so even when we talk about the smaller churches that look healthier on the onset, this is where the majority of our scams take place at. It's actually harder to scam people in the mega churches because they have real boards that have to be certified for real and who have their names on the line. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but a group of 5 guys behind the scenes, and you only ever hear from one of them. Yeah.
Yes. It becomes incredibly toxic, incredibly controlling, even when they have good intentions, because your good intentions are still defined by this book that is outdated and still has these very harmful ideologies. One great example is the story of Ananias and Sapphira. Who God determines that it's a good reason to unalive them because they changed their mind about how much money they wanted to give. If I'm looking at this and I'm calling this the word of God, and that's the way that I'm approaching the way people give at my church, I'm going to be really tempted to use language like that when it comes to giving, especially when I fall on hard times. And that could be me personally, if you want to think of it from the con artist, hey, I can't afford my Lexus payment, or it can fall on good intentions. If we don't get the church paid off, if we don't get this bill paid, we're not going to be able to have a church anymore. So I've got to get these people to give. So I'm going to invoke this divine authority. Yeah. I'm not actually going to come back and look at how we're structured and what we can do. It's nope, y'all got to give. And that becomes dangerous.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right in that. No matter the good intention or not, and not even the temptation to deceive or to manipulate, just the very fact that something that is supposed to be, at least from the New Testament, principles of it, people gathering together with a common goal, whether it's to worship or encourage, has turned into, we must have a building, we must have a parking lot, we must pay so-and-so to be competitive, we must have a worship leader, we must, in general, the very nature of it can't not be corrupted to some degree by a good majority of the people. And what you said at the very beginning of this one, and we'll move on to number 2 because it's connected, but what you said at the very beginning I thought was especially perfect. It was that there's no evidence then that you need God. If it operates in the same fashion, if you need the same capital and startup funds, then what's the difference? And I think that this is such a huge thing for people to understand, the dividing line in the sand, that if this God were real, if his word and spirit did what were claimed to do, you simply couldn't or wouldn't see the fruit, the lack thereof, or rotten fruit that there is in these communities. So I just wanted to say thank you for that point because I thought it was excellent. But moving on to number 2, because it fits so well, was that tithes don't go where you think. I know this to be true myself, but I want to hear it from the horse's mouth. Yes. Where do tithes go?
Tithes go, and we kind of hit this in the first one, they go to operational costs. That's the first place they're going to start. And I should have actually brought this breakdown with me because I have it, of what those typically look like. But I can say, and I feel safe that payroll for the majority of churches is normally about 45% of operational costs. So the majority of your tithes are going to pay people, which again, I'm not necessarily against, but that's not what we say when we communicate it. We don't say we're doing this so we can pay Sister Sally to watch your kids during, children's church or whatnot. We say we do this because God is going to do something for you. So it's going to operational costs. A major chunk is going to payroll. Another major chunk is going to the facilities itself. One thing that people often take for granted is having small houses, right? The moment you start dealing with a large building, electricity is a it's like a second mortgage at that moment. Every time you cut the lights on, you could be risking, an $800 to $1,500 bill, just for a few hours. So facilities end up taking quite a bit of money as well. And then if they're trying to be decent, they'll have an outreach, aspect of their money, for their stuff as well. And many of the churches that I was a part of, to their defense, they were really good at outreach. But the problem was that's never how he talked about it with the members. When it was me and the other pastors in the room and the other sons in the faith, he's very clear about what he's doing, why he's doing it, why we're building it this way, and even talking about how it benefits the members and how it benefits the communities. But on Sunday mornings and on Wednesday nights, when he's talking to the members, that's not the conversation he's having with them. And so my concern became in that is that we're actually separating people from cause and effect. We're out here doing the things, manipulating the things, using critical thinking, engaging this, but then we're telling them that tithes is all spiritual, that this is all spiritual, and telling them God is responsible for their blessing and God is going to do all these other things for them, while we're actually doing the practical and the pragmatic, not depending on the prayer. I had another mentor in Birmingham who literally, and I could not make this up, would have a deal signed. He'd be working on it for a few weeks, so he had a deal to acquire a building, has the deal signed. He's going to go to church that night and say, I feel like God wants us to move. And I think he's going to make that thing happen. Will you pray tonight? Will you sow a sacrificial offering so we can show God our faith? And everybody's going to get hyped up and they're going to pray and they're going to sow seeds and the church is going to feel good and he's going to give a prophetic declaration. And then the very next week, he's going to come back and say, guess what? God did it, y'all. Y'all prayed, y'all sowed, and the deal was signed 2 weeks ago. The deal was all, and that's, again, that language being involved in it, because many people, they're not paying their tithes for payroll. They likely should be, if you're going to be a part of a membership institution, but that's not why. They're not giving their tithes for payroll. There are some who are. There are some who know what they're doing. But a vast majority are giving their tithes because they believe that God is going to do something with their tithes. They believe that those tithes are somehow sacred, are somehow holy. And they don't have a clue that, no, what's happening here is just everyday business. We're using this very supernatural language, even when we're just, the not as supernatural churches, we're still appealing to the authority of God for this, while completely separating people from the way that it's actually operating, which I think the real danger there is not just that we're taking money from these communities. The real danger there is that we're teaching people how to depend on systems that are not dependable, while demonstrating that we actually know how to do things and never teaching that, never sharing that with our congregations. To me, that's dark.
Yeah, that disconnect, I think, is the problem, because not every church will be that corrupt. More churches probably are than most people think. There's people listening right now that would think that didn't happen at my church. And some of them are right, some of them are wrong. But in general, as we kind of talked about on point one, it's just always some level of deception, even if it's good, well-meaning. There's so much, maybe this is the word, there's so much justification that goes into church ministry, church leadership, church management of, a bigger building is going to lead to more people being saved. A bigger building is going to get more butts and seats and help us reach our community better. If we do have that football field, the kids will come and play here, and better that they do that than they do this. And so even the churches that are a little bit more upfront and honest with the congregants of saying, once a quarter they do their big financial statement. I'm sure you were involved in stuff like this, and it's all right, church, today's money talk day. I know it's uncomfortable, but then they list the 40 verses in the New Testament about money so they can make their case about, we still have to talk about it. Don't care if you don't like it. I'm following Jesus's lead here. Look at how much he talked about money. Look at what Paul did when he asked for money. There's nothing wrong with asking for money. They do the whole preamble and they do the justification points, and it may even be true. That more people will be saved, and that it does make one happy to give, and that they are a part of something bigger than themselves. But there's just always the other side of the coin that, like you say, is not being presented to them. And that so many people, I think, have a problem understanding the difference between straight up lying and the lie of omission, of deceit. And when you don't cover the other side of the coin, when you're in a position of power, it's that power dynamic that creates the abuse. And that's what it is. You are abusing these congregants by having them, whether it is tithes or offering. And that's what's hilarious, right? Is because they'll take tithes. Tell me if this was true for you in your experience. That might be the setup from the pastors of, okay, they might even be honest. Sometimes that, we got to pay people. You need your leaders. You need your shepherds. But we're going to take a special offering this Sunday for this. It's like, no, that's what your tithes should have been doing. Like the tithes are for the poor and the widowed and the needy. And it's so manipulative to ask for more because you didn't use the tithes for what you were supposed to anyways. The one stat I do know to be true is 5% of the overall revenue brought in from a church goes towards, and this is on average in the U.S., towards helping the community, whatever you want to call it. That's an insane mismanagement of funds, or at least expectation.
And that really becomes the big problem for me then, or at least one of the biggest problems, because if that's the case, that means you are actually not operating according to your mission. You're not operating according to your 501(c) purpose.
Yes.
And that is problematic. Even just kind of hearing you talk about it, I was like, oh, dang, this is an MLM. Because you're basically getting people to recruit. That's because that's the only product of an MLM for real. The product is recruiting more people. The only problem is you don't get any downline commissions from it. So it's like the worst MLM ever.
Yeah. No, you're 100% right about that. Yeah. You bring in 10 more people. You didn't make anything extra. You got maybe a higher status in the church.
Yes.
Right. And that's also a manipulative game of who is more Christ-like here in the competition nature.
Yes.
These first two were definitely tied together and about the business aspect of the church. I got something this morning. I promise it's not a setup. This is an email I got this morning. And then we'll move on to number 3, which I think is a fascinating one. I went to a church when I first started dating my now wife. We started dating in high school. And so I'm 17 and I came from a AG church. Pretty wild. Yeah. She came from a Lutheran background. And so we kind of, like, as a very serious dating couple, looked for a church that we could go to together, kind of blending things. And it didn't work out in terms of that at that time. But we go to this church for maybe 5 months. They get my email address. I haven't changed my email address since this morning. Okay, like 18 years later, I got this email. Of course, his name is Josiah. Hey, Brandon. And of course, this goes out to everyone that's probably in their email list. I just wanted to follow up on my email from a few days ago and see if you'd be open to leaving a review for the name of this church. I promise I won't bug you again after this. I just want you to know it has a very real impact, with each review potentially helping thousands more come across our website as people search Google for churches near me or faith questions like, who is Jesus? Leaving a review takes just a couple of minutes. It's one of the easiest ways to serve here at Name of the Church. Better yet, it just might help point someone to come inside our building on a Sunday or discover the truth of Jesus in a blog post. And then there's a link to leave the review. And again, a lot of people would not see that as bad. Okay, it's 21st century, social media is real. You got to do what you got to do. But like you said, it's the language, it's the justification, it's the pointing to other things other than the fact that maybe it's because they've gotten a lot of bad reviews. Maybe it's because they're not coming up on their SEO and the person in charge of their marketing who gets 3% of all tithes going directly to paying for their car is sitting there trying to justify their job. And we need more Google reviews. So I'm going to do this email list that I paid some email marketer to help me organize. Like, it is such a clear, it was kismet. I was like, oh, this is perfect. And again, we've seen that stuff growing up in the church forever. But I think there's some people who just don't realize how truly it is no different. No God required.
No God required.
Business. Yeah.
That's it.
Anyways, too funny.
Love it.
Number 3 is one that I think will surprise people. It is you saying that most pastors doubt. Tell me about that.
I think one of the things that people often forget is that pastors don't start in the pulpit. Pastors start in the pews, just like everybody else. And I think what people often imagine is that pastors have a definitive experience where they know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is God calling them into ministry. And from that moment on, they never doubt. And people think that because that is the propaganda. That's what we use. Almost every pastor is, unless they're talking to their close folk, is going to pretty much say, no, I felt the call of God clear as day. What that communicates to other people who are not used to the nuances of that language is that this person has no doubts in God. No, I mean, if you heard him clear as day, how could you ever doubt that? You've seen Darante. How could you ever doubt Darante is a real person? You've talked to Darante on the phone. I mean, you could be getting catfish, but you heard from him clear as day. So people kind of attach that to pastors, that note from the moment they're called, they know God. There's no more questions. And that's not really how it goes. Otherwise, this wouldn't be a faith journey. All pastors are required, just like all believers are required, to faith it until you make it. You know what I'm saying? And I think 100%. that I don't think we wrestle with what that means enough. Because I often tell people, and they get upset sometimes, but I say, I was a believer on credit. And people say, oh, no, don't say that because you're taking credit from something. I'm like, no. This is what all believers are. All believers are believers on credit. You have absolutely no justification for any of this. But what you're saying is, I choose to believe this. And I will engage this relationship with you. I will engage this walk with you. And I believe that if I do this the right way, you will eventually reveal yourself to me, and I will have earned my seat in your audience. This is the way many people approach God, that, it may not be true. It may be true, but I'm going to attach my faith to it. And that's where that relationship starts. I mean, you even think about the first time you're at that altar call, whether it's at a youth camp or a revival or just at a nice church, and you're at that altar call, you're wrestling with the voice in your head. And eventually you assign it to God, because while you're wrestling there, you've already been stoked to say, God is pulling on somebody's heart right now. God is speaking to you right now. You've been going through something that was the sign that this is your week and all of that. And now that conversation becomes a part of your inner dialogue. You're walking down the altar. Is this God? The collective effervescence is working. And then that becomes God for you. But that's not how knowledge works. So for that moment, that is still a doubting moment for that pastor. That moment where you cross over into the ministry, it's you convincing yourself that this is a pursuit worth going after. Not necessarily that you know all of the answers. In many cases in that moment, you have to reassure yourself that you don't know all the answers, and that's why you can't trust yourself, and that's why the faith is necessary. There's really not much difference between how a pastor comes to the faith and how a Christian comes to the faith. There's not much more difference about how that pastor decides to actually live his life. He just got caught by the right altar call on the right day. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And then there were likely some other things there, which I do ask people not to overlook about pastors. Yes, there's a lot of scumbags out here. I get it. But many of them gravitate towards that because they do have a desire to help people. They do have a desire to kind of uplift and stuff like that. And so in those environments, it pulls on you. But what we know from this side looking back, especially all the research we've done by now, is that there's actually no evidence to justify the majority of these beliefs, right? And that's what the pastor, just like the believers, starts their journey believing, that there is evidence. I just don't have it yet. I just haven't had that experience. And so a pastor in good faith is going to spend as much time as they can trying to unravel that. They're going to likely, if you come from a charismatic branch, you're going to start with prayer. You're going to spend a lot of time praying. You know what I'm saying? Because that's how God reveals himself. You're going to pray in tongues a little bit. You're going to fast, and you're going to do all that. If you come from a more doctrinal type of church, you're going to get in his word, and you're going to try to go back and read some of the words of the early church fathers. You're going to go back and revisit Athanasius and Origen. You're going to look at all that stuff to get a better picture, try to get a clear Christianity. But we know from this point, looking back, hindsight is 2020, is that there are no better answers. So that means the pastors who do take that journey, they're immediately hit with not just the doubt of their original conversion experiences and the doubts that they're dealing with every Sunday. Because mind you, I have people who on Sunday will get up and say, God is speaking to me, Pastor. God is moving, Pastor. And then on Monday will be in my office crying. Eyes like bawling. Why doesn't God speak to me, Pastor? Why won't he speak to me? Pastors see that, and then you have to think about the ones who believe. We may be lying to you, but we can't lie. We can only lie to ourselves for so long. So when you're part of a denomination where you believe in healing and stuff, you can only pray for so many people before you realize that, okay, people aren't really getting healed. If you're a part of a denomination that believes in, once people are saved, that they'll never go back, and because they've tasted of the freshness of our Lord, and then you witness people who have these dynamic services with you, and then can blow it all off within the next 3 weeks, you're left to wrestle with all of those memories.
It's such a good point.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Please continue.
I'll just wrap it up right here. There are many pastors who have thought about bringing those doubts to the forefront, because the doubts are not always just, I don't think there's a God. The doubts are sometimes as simple as, I don't know if this is something we should be dependent on. I don't know if this is something that we should trust. I don't know if the way my denomination interprets this is proper. Just something as small as that. We actually have enough observable data on what happens when pastors express their doubts.
Yeah.
They lose their churches.
And their livelihood then, and their community, because, man, you can't go from shepherding people to all of a sudden being buddy-buddy on, Sunday football day. It's when you've just denied this thing. I empathize. I feel for pastors that leave. I think it's probably the hardest deconversion, and it makes sense that it would be. But you brought up something new that I hadn't really thought about. I always knew that, well, I didn't always knew. First of all, I think it's a shock. I think everybody at some point who is a Christian, especially if they grew up that way, there's a day when the veil drops a little bit that the pastor's just a person. Yeah. And that looks like many different things. And it doesn't have to mean that that they doubt or that you're assuming that they're a fraud. There's many things. Oh, you're like, I remember, I was hardcore, man. And one Sunday, one of the new youth pastors accidentally said shit in the middle of his sermon. Yes. And I was like, oh my gosh. Like, first you go through like how could he have done this? I'm so angry, blah, blah, blah. But then it's like, I did too, not that long ago, and it's just, people are people.
Yes.
And I remember another experience that really dropped it. I went back to college later as an adult, and I got a Bible degree at this Christian university. And in my Bible classes, there was also people getting seminary degrees. And I remember hearing their questions, and I remember thinking, like, in a year or 5 years or whatever, like, these people will be up preaching. They'll be in leadership. And I was just amazed. I'm hearing them debate if tithes are biblically commanded. But I would hear them just debate these things and think, like, whatever side they land on, they're going to go to their church in a few years or next week and preach this with all the conviction that you hear every pastor preach with. And I just remember thinking, like, how fallible. And it was. And of course, we should assume that people are fallible and that no one's perfect, but people do hold pastors up in this higher standard. Yep. But what you said about they're the ones that have to deal with the fallout of the reality. When you're an individual believer and you're in your tight little group and you're getting the confirmation bias and you're getting the feedback from on high that what you believe is correct, it's easy to continue to believe despite that one personal doubt you might have in the back of your mind. Yeah. But man, you're right. As a pastor, seeing everybody fail and fall and the hypocrisy, man. I can't imagine the toll that it would take on one's ability to continue to believe. So that's really interesting. Anything left to say on this one before we move on to the next?
Oh man, it definitely takes a toll. The best picture is Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's crying and up to the moment where, I think it's described as some, sweat and blood, and he's saying, if it's at all possible, can you take this cup from me? And, and he ends it with, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. That's what pastoring felt like for much of the time, especially after being exposed to the real issues of people and the real ways that the gospel wasn't actually being a light in their lives to help them to actually solve problems. But I'm still having to get up and preach like it is after I just got this phone call, or even I'm preaching faith and everything in the church is starting to fall financially. And I got to get up and preach like, nope, God always does this and never fails. It always felt like that. God, if it's any way possible for somebody else to do this today, because I've just seen too much,
Yeah, man. I can't imagine. Your fourth one is probably obvious. I don't think we have to take as much time with this one, but give me the highlights here. Church leadership is a boys' club.
Yeah, church leadership is a boys' club, and I think this is one that kind of spans the gamut. It kind of goes all the way across. I think my circles is where the exception kind of applies a little bit more. In the charismatic circles, they do promote women more, and just to highlight that, even in those circles, you'll notice that the women that they do promote tend to preach like men. And so even in the ones that they're more diverse, the idea is that there is this masculine presence, this masculine presentation of the gospel. Because of course there's even when we're becoming progressive in our theological views, there are certain things that have become absolutely static to us. And this hierarchical structure of God, man, woman, child, and some people insert the church in there, somewhere. That's something that almost in church is damn near like the Ten Commandments. This is something that we kind of know. God is the head of everybody. Man is the head of woman. And then woman, she can be the head of the children. At least that's how Paul kind of talks about it.
Right.
And church, that's become so deeply ingrained into us. And not just because we heard it at church, but then because we built our society, and because we were Christians. Our media had Christian stuff in it. Even our education had Christian stuff in it. So you grow up, begin, thinking that this is the way of the world. And the reason I'm putting it that way is because even when there are male pastors who want to promote more women in the church, and you say, you know what? I think Sister such and such, I think she has a nice handle on eschatology. I'd love for her to do a series on it or teach on it. Many of them, just like the pastors who have a doubt, if they were to present that to their congregations, some of them would be lynched. Like, how dare you? Which, dang, I didn't realize that was going to blend in like that. But because there is very much almost like a mob mentality. Like, I do remind people, like, to understand, like, this relationship goes both ways. The pastor manipulates the members just as much as the members manipulate the pastors. And many times it can become a very unhealthy relationship because.
Yeah. What do they call that? Even for us, like audience capture, right?
Yes.
Isn't that kind of I don't know if that's exactly what you're talking about, but I assume it definitely works in churches too, because you can't start stepping outside that expectation or what got you popular or appointed in the first place.
That's it. And so if 75% of the people in your church have this static view that women are less than men, then there's so much baked into that it's really hard for pastors to navigate. And some pastors do, but you can see that they end up in the fringe churches. Like the Presbyterian denomination has been having one of its biggest rifts in history over the past, decade or so, because they've definitely become more progressive, which I'm really grateful for. But it's because those members, it's not always the pastor. I'm going to be honest with you there. Many times they don't care. Sure. Many times they don't care about that type of stuff. But it's the body. It's that audience capture aspect. You cannot deviate from what they want. You cannot deviate from what they consider holy, because they will replace you. Even if you're the one that started the church, they're either going to replace you by voting you out, or they're going to replace you by going to a different church. And that's a scary place to be. Man. But yes, so church leadership, it becomes a boys' club. That's the reason why, primarily because of this idea that there's this hierarchy. Within that that loaded idea, there's the idea that women are emotional, irrational, and basically they're not made in the image of God. They're made in the image of man. And if you had to choose who you were going to be taught by, would you want to be taught by somebody who's in the image of God or somebody who's in the image of man? And that's why I always point back to the language. As long we can become as progressive as we want, but as long as we're still going to highlight this language as holy or insightful or valuable, then we're going to create these problems that platform this. And that's the real issue with pastors, period, in the religious faith, is that they're not actually people who can stand up and say what they believe to be true. Yeah. They have to be tied to whatever their doctrinal statements are or whatever their congregational desires are.
Yeah, you can only go so far if you're going to try to hold or claim that you hold to the source material in any way. Yep. And Paul makes it pretty hard to get women in leadership. And what's funny is the progressive churches that do try to put more women in leadership, they will talk and make their excuses for Paul about, it was that group of women at that church because they had a particular issue. And it's like, read 3 verses down. He explains that it's not that. It is because Eve was the first to be tricked. Right. She was the weaker one to be deceived. And thus we can't trust her. And so then that goes for all women. He it's insane, the excuses you have to make, but you do make them in the sake of being progressive, which means the more progressive you get, the less biblical you get. Yep. And then you have you have both issues. When I watched your video and I was kind of thinking through some personal examples, and I'll only share one or two here really quick and we'll move on to the next one. I do remember I was at a church at one point that was pretty forward thinking, and there were women on staff. Yeah. Of course, the head pastor was not a woman. You know, that's still very, very rare. But Mother's Day comes around. And so then it's the pastor's wife is going to get up and give a sermon, you know, rah for the women. And it was like, that's so much worse. I remember thinking,
yes,
than just letting the male pastor do it. Cause it was like he was allowing her, like, oh, it's your day. Here's your one day of the year. And I just remember thinking, like, this isn't progress. This is stupid.
Yes.
And just one little thing. Like, it's amazing how they do try to cope, or they feel like they're making inroads, or they're allowing women to do this. And it's the behind the scenes. In your video, you talked a lot about they're the ones who get to organize the bake off and stuff like that. And it's just so, like, you're not what you think you are.
Yep.
But anyways, too funny. The next one, to get a little more serious, although that is still definitely a problem, but I don't mean to diminish it. Number 5, though, was that the church thrives off fear and guilt. Let's hear it.
All right, and this one strikes on a few levels, right? Because and this is the thing that I find to be the most amazing, is because whether you're talking about progressive churches, whether you're talking about more conservative churches, whether you're talking about the more charismatic Pentecostals, or even the more ecclesiastical churches, you're going to find this. You're going to find this on the spectrum, and that's this fear and guilt aspect. So the most common one that most of us are familiar with, which many modern churches have deviated from a long time ago, is the fear of hell. You don't want to go to hell, and so they're going to remind you, don't forsake the assembly of yourselves together. They're going to remind you, this is why you need to tithe, because if you don't tithe, you'll be cursed. And they're going to remind you, this is why you need to volunteer or do things like this. So there's the hell fear. But then it goes beyond that, because I've watched this fear evolve across different denominations. Some, it's not the hell fear. They're not going to do that, because you can only use hell for so many times. After a while, it's not useful for certain people. Hell was never useful for me. So what do? You use this other fear. You're going to be isolated from your loved ones. You'll never see them again. You're never going to see your loved ones again. They're going to evolve that fear. That's not enough. Let's throw some guilt in there. Did you see how bloody Jesus's crucifixion was? Did you see how bruised up he was? He did that for you. So now you're feeling bad that somebody else has put themselves through this for you. Now, the reason they do this, or that we do this, and when I say they, I want to be clear here that I'm not necessarily suggesting that people are sitting in a back room saying, "Oh, how can we manipulate these people this weekend?" You know, and there may be some who are. But for the most part, you know, we are a very responsive species. The phrase monkey see, monkey do is fairly appropriate for us, you know, in the sense that most of what church leadership does is simply imitating what they've seen those who came before them do. So even when they're doing things that are manipulative, they don't necessarily understand always that these things are manipulative. What they understand is, this is the language we speak. This is the culture. This is how we talk about things, and this is effective, you know. So they use these different fear aspects. Now, the modern church, they don't do the hell thing. They don't do the fear of the afterlife, because the millennials, they just weren't going for that for real. That just wasn't enough for them. We got so inundated with comics on television. We got so innovated, inoculated with all different types of fantasy stuff, that those things didn't work for us. So in many of the modern churches, the seeker movement, the fear is that you'll never live up to your best. The fear is that you'll miss God's best for your life. God has a plan, and you will never be able to make that plan happen on your own. And so if you're not with God, you're missing that plan. And that one is so insidious, because that's the easiest one to preach. This is where your Joel Osteens are. This is where your Stephen Furticks are. These are where these guys are hiding out at, in these messages that don't talk about hell. They're not talking about heaven and seeing your loved ones. They're talking about your best life. And those are the clips you're getting on television, is these really positive, uplifting message. But what it's attached to is the strings of, you have to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior to get this. And so it's that fear of missing out. It's FOMO. So going back to the why do we do this? Why do we attach that? Because it has a high emotional resonance. Yeah. It's giving you that fear, like you are missing out. You're not getting this, and this is the only way to get it. It's much easier to get people to make a decision when they're afraid than any other time. It's easier to manipulate people. And so this is one of the reasons why they kind of pull us in. And again, I know I keep saying they, and I hope everyone understands that even me, this is language I used. I was definitely on that side. You're missing God's best for your life. You have no idea what God could be doing with you because you won't try it his way. You've done it your way. What are you going to lose if you try it his way? You know, I'd even go as far as to say, oh yeah, because this is the one that got me. Every day, you're either leading people to heaven or you're leading people to hell. Yeah. You know, which is like, oh, now I'm responsible for other people being, you know, damned eternally because I'm not living in the plan of God. It's a very effective strategy to get quick action out of people without getting them to process what they're thinking about. And that's that, you know, we use the same thing to kind of make videos go viral sometimes. It's clickbait. That's what it is. It's clickbait.
Well, and in comparing it with like a YouTuber is an interesting thing too, because, you know, you've probably seen certain videos of yours have done better than others. Mm-hmm. I've had certain videos do better than others. I think the first time that I did a video on Satan or demons, it was like, it blew up comparatively to what I had been doing, as I would monotonously go through a verse that I thought was contradicting.
Yes.
And so there's that potential to be like, I'll follow that. And it's not manipulative. It's not like, oh, I'm following the money. Mm-hmm. It's like you're making videos to get views. You're doing things like, obviously you want to kind of interact with the audience in a certain way, but it's magnified from the pulpit, right?
Yes.
Because you're up there preaching. And if you notice every single time, and you might not even consciously notice it, it might be the subconscious reactions that are coming from the congregants who perk up, who are listening more, who are showing more emotion, who are crying. It's like, that sermon was good today, you know, and like, then you're going to start constructing more like that. And all of a sudden you turn into a fire and brimstone church in the 70s, or you turn into the seeker movement today, et cetera, because you're following the subconscious cues of the trends that are going on from all the other psychological factors. And so, yeah, you're right. And I'm so glad you said it. It's not men in a back room conjuring up how to scare people into giving their tithes. It is a relationship back and forth that continues to naturally adapt itself and evolve into what humans are motivated by, fear and pleasure. And if you can't preach about heaven, then you're going to preach about the loss, the hell, the separation, the fear, you know, the not doing your best, etc. So, man, it's a sociological experiment to the highest degree. Religion is, and church especially.
It is. Well, you know, that's one of the major things with the urban churches now is I started realizing that many of the sermons are trauma traps. Where the whole sermon is like how much you went through this week, how hard life is for you. But ain't you glad you got God on your side? You didn't even know how you were going to make it through this month. You didn't even know how your bills was going to get paid. And I started like, oh, if we're preaching this every Sunday, if this is the hospital, you know what I'm saying? Why is it that when I'm coming here, the only thing I'm hearing is how hard my life is? And if the preacher is preaching that, that's the temperature he's taking. If the preacher every week is preaching, you know, you're struggling, then he knows this is the thing that resonates the most with this audience. And again, it's very responsive. This is why we like drama. This is why we like Lifetime. It speaks to us. It's highly resonant. He's watching them respond to it. And in his mind, he's thinking, I'm encouraging them. You didn't think you were going to make it, but look at God, while never really wrestling with, hey, what are you saying then? That means that these people are stuck in a cycle. Of poverty, of betrayal, of not having healthy friendships. So maybe we need to shift some of the teaching to that. Maybe we need to shift some of the conversation to that so that we're not saying this every week, but we begin again where there's that slippery slope when this becomes performative, that it's not actually about helping people. Oh, dang, I didn't mean to slip up into this. It's not actually about helping people. It's getting that momentary validation, that dopamine rush. And so for the pastor, whether they get better or not is irrelevant many times. It eventually has to be, because you have no control over it. It becomes, did they respond in the moment? And if there was a response in the moment, that's that temporary validation. So when I do have those moments of doubt, but you remember when you were preaching and such got up, they said that was the word they needed. Do you remember that time you prayed for such and such, and you remember how they fell out under the power of God? That was God's evidence. You have to make so many of these other things that you begin to pull on. But yeah, man.
It's interesting. I mean, there's two things you said there, because you can take it both ways. You're talking about certain communities that might be more, struggling, and so that's the message that they get. And then the affluent communities, they get the prosperity gospel because they're all well off. They don't need to be scared of anything. They're going to hear the reason all of you have the security you have is because you've placed your faith in God, and it's a reinforcement of wherever they are at, in particularly. But and prosperity gospel is gross for many reasons. But what you're talking about, these trauma traps, I think that's especially hard or harmful because, something I realized during my deconstruction, and people called me proud for it. Like it was a pride issue. But I was like, I went to a church. The last church I ended up at was CMA, Christian Missionary Alliance. Yeah. And I don't know if all CMA churches operate this way, but my particular church had made the choice to only preach the gospel every single Sunday. Oh. They would reference Old Testament verses to get to their prophecy or get to the illusion that they needed for the sermon. Yeah. But every Sunday was going to be a gospel message, period. Wow. And I just remember, of course, the gospel message is you're a broken sinner who needs, the atonement of Jesus, blah, blah, blah. And it was just like, you can never arrive. And I remember thinking like, essentially, we're called to be perfect. Yep. It's because we're not perfect that we need Jesus. And in some parts of the Bible, there's an admission that we can't be perfect, like Romans 3:23. But then there's parts in 1 John that tell you have to be perfect or you don't know the Father. And when your church doesn't let you arrive, if you're always going to be the broken sinner who, hey, raise your hand if you messed up last week. Like, of course I'm going to raise my hand, but don't you expect us not to? Like, shouldn't we have had the power of the Holy Spirit helping us not to? And I just remember, like, again, I was pretty heavy in my doubting, deconstructing, and seeing more of the glaring issues. And I just thought, like, yeah, you can never arrive. And so what you're talking about, those kinds of churches and pastors, man, talk about keeping people down.
Yes.
It's awful.
Yes.
Yeah. Number 6 was a funny one to me because it's so obvious once you said it, but I don't know if I had really considered it. And it is that most church growth is just people switching churches. Tell me about that.
Yes. All right. So in my early years, my belief was definitely people get saved who did not know the Lord, and that's how the church grows. I spent about 5 years active in campus ministry on schools, starting in about 8th grade. And that was really the majority of my ministry. So I did spend like the majority of my ministry with unbelievers because you get a lot of that in middle school. Everybody thinks they're a non-believer, Right. So you get a lot of people who claim to be everything. And I really thought that's what church looked like altogether. But that's just really not what happens. I did, convert a lot of people who came from Christian households and their family went to different churches, but that time didn't identify as Christian, likely because they went to churches that said you're not a real Christian unless you're doing.
I was going to say some of it too is the pastor counting it as a new convert because now they have them in the right Christianity.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
And so after I got out of campus ministry and got involved with churches, that's when it became glaringly obvious. In middle school and high school, it kind of hid from me a little bit because these were people who did not consider themselves Christians, even though if I would look at them today, I was like, oh no, you were Christian. You were already exposed to the gospel. You were already told God is the good guy and the Bible is his word. You just weren't living by any of that. And so that's your line of delineation. But that was good enough for me back then. But once I became an adult and started getting involved with churches more, I'm like, wait a minute. By this time, I think I'd been in for about 5 years after high school. And I'm thinking, all of these years, I've never had somebody walk down an altar at any of the churches that I'm at who seriously had never heard of Jesus before, who seriously did not have a church that they were a part of before coming here. Like at best, many of the people who are coming just had been out of church for a while. You know what I'm saying?
I stopped going for 6 months and I'm an atheist now, or I turn my back on God, even if they don't use the big A word. And then, you've saved them now.
Yep.
Count it. Check.
And so
they get rebaptized for the 5th time because they're addicted to it. Check.
That's it. Backslidden. It's a backslider coming back home, and that's ultimately what it ends up being. They're not actually out there recruiting new people. Not in the way that we think. There aren't people who are coming to Jesus and they've never known him before, and they have this dynamic experience. We're all kind of pre-baked into it. And then so for the church world, we think of getting converts by going into a neighborhood that's overwhelmingly Christian and knocking on the doors and asking, do you want to come to my church this Sunday? Would you like to check out my church? And so if that person comes to the church, what are we going to say? If that person joins the church, we're going to say, this person just joined the church. This person just joined the kingdom of God. And we'll even be bold enough to say this person is a new believer. Even if this person, 9 times out of 10, we're not going to ask if you ever believed before. We're going to start with, are you living like Jesus is your Savior? You know what I'm saying? And if your answer is no, you're not a believer. That's where that goes from there. And so you're a new believer from there. But when you actually look at the data, and you don't have to bore yourself with this, you can just pick the most happening church that's in your city and go there on a Sunday and watch the altar call. You know what I'm saying? Ask some questions. Say, hey, so what did you do before you joined this church? Where did you go before? Just ask some very innocuous questions, and you'd be surprised that you're not going to find somebody there other than the propaganda that we put out who is like, ooh, I was a Muslim, and then the spirit of Yahweh led me out of my car to come into your sanctuary. It just doesn't work that way, by far and large. And because of that, many of the numbers of churches have been inflated. And so Christianity has been dying for a very long time. And the people who've had a front row view to that are the pastors. We've known.
Again, I said, as soon as I heard you say it, I was like, well, of course, because it's a math problem at the end of the day. If churches are closing more than they have before, which it's, the biggest thing that's happened since the year 2000 is like church closings in America. And if the number of nuns are going up, that means there's less places for Christians to go.
Yes.
And they're moving around. Like, of course, it is just a recycle issue. And I looked up the math actually after I saw your video or some data. It was 80% of new believers are people that have been in church in the past year, just now at a new church. And then the other stat that was interesting was it was like the top 75% of the reason that people move churches actually has nothing to do with doctrinal issues like we would think, they're moving from one denomination to another. It was a scandal that happened in the last church. It was a disagreement that they had with leadership that was irreconcilable. It was a fight, amongst congregants, like very personal, very human reasons, not led by the Spirit, not a Christian, now a Christian, just we're not going there anymore.
Yes.
And it's so true. It's so obvious. So yeah, I was really glad you included that because it's too much, man.
Yes.
Anyways, number 7 is one that I've also done a ton of research on. Again, since I read Dan Barker's Godless book, because him having been in worship ministry, he talks about the science behind all of this. That was the first time that I understood, and it made so much sense to me as a lover of music. So let me introduce it, and then I'll give my personal example, then I'll let you speak. Number 7 was that worship music is designed to manipulate you. And yes, and even if it's not purposeful, it still has that effect. The best comparison, of course, is concerts and music in general, that we can achieve these states without having to go to church and being involved, that it's just working off human psychology. My personal example, I remember that I always got goosebumps in worship service, even from a very young age. And and of course you're told the Spirit is here today. I feel it. And sometimes it's not, but I guess, some Sundays are more magical than others. And, again, like you enter in, like there's these terminologies like entering in during worship and stuff.
Yes.
And then 5th grade, I've got my first girlfriend. I'm a little romantic at heart. I hear Back at One by Brian McKnight on the radio. Yes. I go and I buy that CD. It was my first CD, actually. And I'm listening to it alone in my room, thinking about Jennifer, my girlfriend. And I'm overcome with like little 5th grade emotion of love. And I get the chills and I get the goosebumps and I get all of it. And I thought like, oh, this is exactly what happens at church. And of course it didn't mean anything to me then. Interesting fact to me, nothing else. But it so clear looking back to me now, how much this happens to everybody, and we misattribute the psychology to God. Yes. So I kind of stole your thunder on this one.
No.
But you have more here to fill in, so let's hear your side.
Well, I wanted to piggyback on that for a while, just that for a little bit, because that happens a lot, right? Because it is a very common experience. It's a human response. It's a human reaction. It's biological, neurological, psychological, and sociological. But what happens is sometimes, because you gave an example when you were still in school, but there are adults who have that same type of situation. And so you have someone who's deeply ingrained into this type of ideology. And if they're at home and they listen to this song and they have this experience at home, listening to this love song while thinking about Jennifer, some of them might make the leap of, because that was a sign of God at church, this is now a sign from God now. And Jennifer's supposed to be my wife. And God just let me know. And cause, I saw that happen. I saw that happen a lot. But I appreciate you saying, like, many times it's not intentional. Very much, I like to use the faith healers, for example, because I was one for a while. Many faith healers are not purposefully trying to scam anybody. Many of them are just convinced that something is happening, as the members are, because again, they were indoctrinated the same way. They are victims of the same indoctrination. And so even for me, there were certain things that I was convinced God was doing because of the reaction. So, for example, I've been watching healing evangelists, pretty much ever since I've been saved. And when they pray for people, it's really aggressive. It's really performative. They do a lot of moving. It's very animated. And so they're praying for you. They're going to hold your head. They push your shoulders a little bit, raise your hands, raise them high, hit your hands. What you'll begin to notice is there's a pattern that if you have a physical ailment, the more they hit you. Now, they don't know that they're doing this to create a distraction in your mind from the pain that you came up here for. They're doing this because this is the appropriate way to walk in the anointing. This is the appropriate way to walk in authority. This is how my mentor did it. And so somebody comes up and you say, hey, who's experiencing back pain? I got back pain right now. Come up here. The glory of the Lord is already over you. And see, now what I may not have understood then, that person is immediately going to be having an emotional response at that moment, because I've just created this stage where I've told them that the most important person in their life, their God, has set aside this moment just for them. And this is likely the thing that they've been praying about for a very long time. And so there's this finally my turn moment, this overwhelming amount of emotions. Now the pastor who's doing this, he doesn't know anything about that. He just knows this person is responding. The music is going really well, and he sees that person crying. In his mind, this is evidence that God is on him. So he's going to start saying that. That's going to reinforce that for the person more. And then he's going to start hitting those hands, hitting those shoulders, and he's going to ask the question, do you feel that back pain? And that believer he's going to honestly check. And the pastor is honestly asking. And the believer's going to say, I don't feel the back pain. No, of course you don't, because I've been hitting you all over your body. So your mind doesn't know what to focus on. But I don't know that. You don't know that. We're both convinced that it's a miracle. So I said that to say this is the way the music goes. Music ministry was very important to me. This is one of the reasons why I'm like, I don't want to say I hate it, but it breaks my heart that religious superstition has prevailed for so long. Because I wish more psychologists, neurologists, and social scientists had access to these services, to these moments, because there's so much that we've learned about our biology and our neurology and ways that we're almost able to hack our own emotions, hack our own experiences, because that's what we're doing in church. The longer you're in music ministry, eventually you'll start saying words like, we're creating the atmosphere. We're setting the atmosphere. And that's literally what we are doing. The problem is we're so disconnected from the cause and effect, is that we're absolutely doing some amazingly magical things, but we don't know what we're doing. We don't know how we're doing it. We don't know why we're doing it. And the most damaging thing out of that whole thing is not that it's happening. It's actually, that's probably the healthiest part of any church service, is that moment. You get those endorphins released. You're building your immune system. There's so much good things that are happening in that moment. The most damaging thing that happens is when a person sincerely asks, why am I feeling this? And you tell them it's God.
Yeah.
That's the damaging part, because you've now completely disconnected this person from the knowledge of how their selves operate, And honestly, that's useful information for me. Like I grew up with very bad depression and anxiety, and I always felt great in worship. If I would have known that this isn't God that's doing this is just the power of people being together
Yeah.
and sharing in this art form, then I wouldn't have spent so many nights crying out, wondering why I wasn't feeling that same presence at home sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
You know what
Because
I'm
then
saying?
you're told like, oh, even if you're not specifically told, it is impressed upon you that if you feel something at church that is now associated with God, that doesn't happen for you most of the rest of the week. You might be able to conjure it up if you do enough of the right things, but it usually doesn't happen in your quiet time just by yourself that it does to the extent in worship with the rhythm and the chanting and the chord progression, etc.
Yes.
And yeah, you then become the problem.
Yep.
What am I doing wrong? What secret sin is in my life? What changed even from Sunday? Like the amount of lunacy that it leads to, and of course, like the feedback loops to make you more anxious and more depressed. You're right. It is only the reinforcement, the misattribution of what the psychology is happening that makes it harmful. Otherwise, and maybe this is something you do as you try to create these secular community groups,
Yes.
is still let people have the experience.
Yes.
Because
my
it is
goodness.
beneficial, but it's just under the right pretenses.
Yep.
I would assume.
And that's that actually is a passion of mine, because it's beneficial for communities, it's beneficial for individuals, but then there's another like just hidden aspect that we don't often think about when we think about the church. But the church has created opportunities for people to do the things that they love in ways that they wouldn't have had those opportunities elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so for me as a musician, if there weren't churches that had pianos, especially as someone who grew up in poverty, I would have never been able to learn how to play the piano. I would have never got introduced to music the way that I did. Christianity, religion itself, it's because it's built off of communities, built on the back of communities, it's also an opportunity creator. And that's something that we can definitely learn from in the secular community, because we have hobbyists in our community just like anybody else do. And many of those people are robbed of experiences. And so that's when I think of my days in church, I think of how many people who loved children who would have never had an opportunity to, impact children if it wasn't for being able to volunteer in children's church, or how many people loved music. And many of them today that's their living. Their living is making music in the communities that they care about. And, I do advise the secular community that those opportunities we're overlooking. And so I do now. I don't do it often, but every now and then I'll break out my piano on our lives and do a little song that I've written, because I realized that even as a worship pastor, God's attention was somebody who I could never get. So I was always judging the success of a worship service by the people.
Sure.
And so I eventually began realizing that, I wasn't passionate about singing love songs to God. I was passionate about creating experiences for people that made them feel better about themselves, that made them feel better in that moment. And that's something I still love to do. And I'm looking forward to the day where I can do it with a group again, because there's just nothing like it. Like if there's anything I miss, it's that, like especially like when I pastored, because I still did music with my team when I pastored, and our music was dope, and we had fun times. Like it was amazing. It was the least churchy part of our services.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so true. The lack of opportunity. And I hope that people who are listening are hearing. I think it would be easy to get on and have a conversation about church and talk about the pastors that get up to manipulate because they want to get rich, and the pedophiles that get into it because they have access to kids. But there are so many pastors, like you mentioned, that really believe it. There are so many healers and worship leaders that actually think what they're doing is beneficial. There are so many people that actually love kids in a healthy way, and they have access to being able to influence people and help raise them. Again, like we would see the downside of the indoctrination that's happening there, but it's not all of those side cases. Like there are so many good people that church provides the outlet for the good, supposedly. But if there's so much downside and so much byproduct of harm, creating the communities in lieu of that still provide for that. Perfect. I love it so much. We have 3 left here. And number 8, maybe getting, despite what I just said, we will kind of circle back to some of the abuse. The pastor has more power than you realize. And again, I don't even think this is going to be, from what you said in the video, a pastor wielding this power incorrectly on purpose.
Right.
Just the dynamics. So go ahead.
Absolutely. All right. So in most cases, the pastor is not intentionally trying to wield power over you. He's just trying to do his job. He's trying to be the person that he's called to be. And there's a dynamic that's created in the church space that's not often created in other spaces. And that is the pastor is responsible in many cases for being the voice of God, or at the very least, the representative of God. You're the one who is supposed to have the answers. Now, I introduced it that way because that's often how it starts with even the most well-intentioned pastor. There's a pastor who comes in and they're like, I don't want to tell you anything what to do about your life. I don't want to do this. I'm going to preach the word from the Bible, and we're just going to learn from that. And then we're going to go home. There are many pastors who would love to do that, but somebody's going to ask them for counseling. Somebody's going to ask them for prayer, and then somebody's going to ask them for clarity. And this is where that slope kind of starts happening, because now what we know is many of the answers, if you've been in ministry, many of the answers you can give are not really satisfying unless this person is already a true believer and just wanted you to hear some scripture. And they're going to say, oh, that's all I needed to hear. Thank you. But by far and large, when you're giving advice from scripture, people are like, I don't know if that works. I don't know if that's it, and so you end up dealing with that for so long. And the thing is, they don't say, well, maybe you're not the one I need to talk to about this one. They don't say, well, let me go check with such and such. They're going to keep pressing you for that answer. And if they do get to the point, maybe you're not the one that should have the answer, they're going to leave your church. So there is this pressure to be the person who has the answer, even when you're the person that don't want that. And the thing is, we've in many churches, created this environment where you're telling people that they're not capable of making their own decisions. You're telling people that they cannot lean into their own understandings. You are telling people that they are broken, that you're telling people that their heart is wicked and deceitful above all. Who can possibly know it? You're telling them that within their flesh there is no good thing that dwells within them, because what they want to do, when they want to do good, they do wrong. And when they want to do wrong, they do good. And so you've given them this idea that you're not qualified to make your own decisions, even when you're not saying those words exactly. So they feel the need for the representative to at least have the answers, especially if God has not given me the answers. And so this is how this kind of starts in a more insidious way, where you can have the well-intentioned pastor who begins to realize, if I don't get more authoritative, if I don't get more absolute in my answers, they're going to feel like I don't know what I'm talking about, or I'm not as close to God, and they're going to leave the church, right?
And so, it won't even work for them. Like, even if they're seeking comfort, you might even think in a good way, like, you know what? I'm 99% sure I have great faith, but I need to convey it like this so that they can receive it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that becomes how that kind of can start, even with the best intentions. And so you begin to realize, like, it's kind of like cat and mouse relationship. I have to be this for them. But then that becomes a part of your identity, that I am the one with the answers. And so it started as you're being reluctant to give people answers, to be able to be that comfort for them and to make sure that the organization stays strong. But then what's to stop it from becoming, I just don't want people to disagree with me? Because remember, the slippery slope here, I've used that word a lot today, that phrase a lot. But the thing that started us here was, I'm doing this to stop one outcome, which means slippery slope was perfect for this. I'm doing this because I think if I don't do this, it's going to lead to this, and this. So what's to stop you when you see Sister Shirley, who meets Joe the plumber and decides, I think this is the one. And then you entertain that same type of fallacy and begin to think, well, you know what? He grew up in a Lutheran church his whole life. He didn't come from the Baptist church. I think he's going to lead her away from the faith. It makes it that much easier for you if you're in the Pentecostal church to get a word from the Lord, or if you're in a more traditional church to want to give some word of encouragement and some advice. You have a little anecdotal story. It might even slip up in your sermon a little bit about, and there it is, perfect landing place.
Man, that's crazy. Yeah, you're so right. Yeah, it's funny because I hadn't thought about how that worked in, but even when I first watched your video, when I got to this one, I was kind of like, I don't know about this one, because when I think of myself as a Christian, I think of my authority being from the Lord, and I think that's how most Christians would think of themselves. And then they might be like, yeah, I knew the pastor was the head of the church, and there's some authority in that. But what you're actually talking about is not the pastor saying, hey, you give me your money. It's not that kind of power. It's the influence, sometimes very subtle, sometimes, if it's one-on-one counseling session, very direct of, and you gave a few examples quickly in your video, but it was, like who to marry, what kind of jobs you're going to get involved in. Like you hear so much stuff, so much reinforcement. I mean, that is a level of influence that probably shouldn't be coming from some individual who is, again, just a person and doesn't know you, isn't going to be invested in your life for the long haul. Every pastor that's ever put a word into my spirit, quote unquote, doesn't know me, doesn't know me anymore, doesn't follow up with me. We don't have conversations. They're not responsible for the paycheck that I make from the work that I go to. They're not going to be there during my marital bliss or marital fights. So much influence with no responsibility, ultimately. Which I think is where the danger lies.
Well, I mean, you think about it. In many churches, when people want to get married, who do they go to for counseling? The pastor. They're going through marital stress. Who do they go to for counseling? The pastor. They have a child who's dealing with suicide ideation. Who do they go take that child to? The pastor. This creates both imposter syndrome and the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is contributing to both of those.
Sure.
And it creates a horrible scenario because now everything is coming to you. This is in some cases going to build up that ego, because that's kind of how muscle building works, right? If people are bringing all their problems to you and you don't have a type of epistemology that can say, hey, I don't think I'm the one that should be doing this. I don't think I'm qualified. If you're not in the place to say that about yourself, then every time you do this and they thank you, that's what you're going to take as a sign that you're doing this well. And
and then you'll only remember your wins. You only remember the one time the kid got better instead of some of the other outcomes. Yeah.
Which is why, like, the latter years of pastoring, I stopped doing marital counseling altogether. And I actually told my church, I said, if you're coming to me for marriage counseling, you're not taking your marriage seriously. I don't understand what you looked at about me that chose me. If you see, and of course, what it is there's that other aspect. I was free. I'm your pastor. You're already paying me.
Well, I mean, but how honest of you at the end. I'm sure the dissonance is near impossible, and that's why everyone has to, not everyone. I think that's the deciding factor, right? You see enough of that, and you're like, okay, I can't do anymore. It's so dishonest. Or you get the lifelong pastor that doesn't believe anymore, but they've committed to the stick. That's it for them now. So kudos on you for facing the music, so to speak. But you're right, man. It's such a, like, there are people trained, real counselors, even if they're, forget secular counseling. There's even Christian counseling. But you're right. It's an admittance of defeat if you, of the pastor, has to say, you should go elsewhere. And what a tempting, awful situation to be in there. Before we move on to number 9, I'm going to tie two of these together because I just had this realization like a month ago. When you've been deconverted for 10 years, I've been deconverted for, 4 to 6. It's hard to say.
Wow.
And you still get memories or like new, you're like, that's what that really was. Just a little bit ago, I remembered a situation when my wife and I went to premarital counseling with a pastor that he was going to officiate the wedding. So we had to go through him. And he was a pastor at my mom's church and where I used to go. But anyways, he's telling us the importance of tithing. Really important marital stuff. Not if you're sexually compatible, but make sure you're giving your money away. And he gives an example of him and his wife. And he said, we've been keeping track. We've been tithing for 50 years now. We've been married and we have made more every year than the year before. Look at how God has blessed us. And at the time I ate that up, and I've known better for so long as an adult, but it wasn't until recently that I was like, well, yeah, most people make more as they get older. You like, that's generally how it works. Like, of course there's exceptions, but this is not proof of the pudding, but it said it with so much conviction, and you tie it into the scriptures. And then all of a sudden, like, my wife and I, as very non-wealthy people who got married at a very young age, as not to burn with lust, at 21, are giving away 10% of what is a very little income and struggling financially, which is the number one reason for divorce. And I thought, like, this can't be further from marital counseling, looking back, of course. But anyways, let's move on. 2 left. Number 9, Christianity survives only because of indoctrination. I agree. Let's hear it.
Yes, this is one that I've actually wrestled with ever since I started my own deconversion journey. Even when I was a young atheist, which again is not how I would have categorized it then, I still believe that God was the good guy.
I see.
And, so like I'd be reading through the Bible because I had an aunt who was sort of hyper religious that would, if I got in trouble at school, they used to make you write your name on the board over and over again. She'd make me write out the Bible.
Oh, wow.
And, fun times that backfired on her. So, I'm writing it out and I'm reading stuff. And especially like when you're in Genesis and Exodus and you're like, that can't be right. That can't be good. But I can remember even then I was wrestling with, but God is the good guy. We know that, and that's even me not believing the book.
Yeah.
That shows how much I had already been exposed to this religious ideology. And then I began to realize that, oh no, this is not just church. This is in our language. This is in our movies. This is in our music. Even when you listen to hip hop music, it could be the most debauchery hip hop song in the world. And you're likely to hear some Christian reference, some reference to
Tupac
God.
says only God can judge me.
Yes,
I mean, it's everywhere. You're 100% right.
And so for the like, I'd say, and I am spitballing here, but I'd say 75% of people who ever make the decision that Jesus is going to be my Lord, and then I'm going to live my life for God, already believed that this God was good, already believed that this book was his word. How does that happen other than indoctrination? So you could meet a person who hasn't been to church since they were, a kid. And even then they only went once or twice with their grandma. And if that person gets saved, we say, oh, this person just got saved. And it's like, no, this person has been stewing in this their entire lives. And that's the tricky part, right? Because then it's easier to convince yourself that you did the work. It's easier to convince yourself that, no, I had a genuine experience, because you don't realize that the indoctrination took place long before you actually made the decision.
Or that you had 70,000 experiences that you didn't count as the one before that.
Yes.
You're picking and choosing for your testimony. But yeah.
Yes. Because you before you even read the book, you already knew what it said. So you've actually never read the book for what it is by that time, in most cases. And I know that's an absolute, but in most cases, what you begin to find is that many Christians, they read the Bible through a filter of indoctrination, because that's what I was doing, even when I could have classified myself as an atheist, because I was still looking through this book through the filter of goodness, even though I had never read it, which means I had no justification for that attachment. That becomes the evidence of that indoctrination. But that's how churches survive. You sow that seed earlier, not churches, Christianity rather. You sow that seed earlier. So there are people out there who don't consider themselves religious, but they still love Jesus. Even though they don't live like it, even though they don't act like it, even though they're doing probably the most devilish things, Monday through Sunday, because indoctrination at the end of the day is not about behavior. That's the next part. Indoctrination is about rote memorization. It's that part. The smart people, I say smart people, but the smart people take that and then turn it into behavior modification. Mm-hmm. And that's when it gets really, really dangerous. But no, it's not very difficult to run into someone who's not religious, but is religiously indoctrinated.
Yeah. The nuance is important, because I do think people are too quick to categorize Christian and non-Christian. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, as we have seen through all of the Christians hopping on Richard Dawkins for his statements on cultural Christianity, is that if you live in the U.S., you have been exposed to this, and you can say that you were a God hater, and you can say that you didn't believe in God, and you can do all of these things for your testimony. But it's the old argument that apologists hate and they demean and they try to roll their eyes at, that if you were born in a different country, you probably wouldn't be a Christian. It's unavoidably true. There are definitely adults who convert, and it's usually based off severe emotional circumstances.
Absolutely.
And they can also do it to many other religions. It's not like you can only have a healing emotional experience under a Christian conversion. People do it to Islam all the time. People do it to Hinduism. People do it to dead religions still. They think they're digging back up Zeus, and they're having an emotional experience. But it's so unavoidably true. And it's I think the experiment part that is hard to show that it's true is you can't take God out, the God concept out of the society. Yeah. But if you could isolate a group of people for 30 years, yeah, they might invent some kind of superstition or stigma or something that is, because we're always trying to pattern and give answers for things we don't know. But they're not going to invent Jesus Christ.
Right.
And they're not going to hear about Jesus Christ unless you tell someone about God and Jesus and the story and the garden and the Bible. They don't have that backdrop, so that later when they are 30 and have that emotional experience, it happens to be that they convert to Christianity.
Yep.
Well, if all they've ever known is Allah and the Quran, guess what they're going to do with that personal experience? They're going to convert to Islam. Like, it's so, again, unavoidably true. I don't understand how that is not like the religion killer right there. It's so obvious. But you're right to, again, what my point, I got sidetracked. My point about the nuance was people think of indoctrination as on mother's knee. I was told that this is it and it was reinforced, and that's definitely a part of it, but it also is your surroundings. It's everything.
Yeah. You even hear it in the atheist community. People say it all the time. They say, no, I don't believe in Jesus. I don't believe in God, but Jesus was a great guy. That's indoctrination.
Totally.
That's that language. You didn't read this book and come to that conclusion because
you didn't read Revelation for Jesus. You didn't read the parable of the 10 before him. Yeah.
I struggled with seeing Jesus as a good guy as a young minister because he'd tell people stuff like when a guy said, "Hey, I want to come follow you, but my dad just died," and he said, "Well, let the dead bury their dead," and I'm like, I can't say that to anybody without them calling me a jackass. Like people, So I struggled with seeing Jesus as a good guy, but so many people, even in the secular community, do, and watch the beautiful many even who never went to church. They were raised in secular households. They will even say, "Well, I think Jesus was a pretty good guy," but that's because that's how indoctrination works. It's not something that requires you to have a justification. Point.
I'm gonna make a new video, Alex O'Connor indoctrinated. I'll just show the clip of him talking about, because you're so right. Like, he fundamentally knows Christianity isn't true. Mm-hmm. He sees the contradictions. But when asked which religion would you like to be true, which philosopher would you like to have lunch with, it's Jesus. I think he's even recently said, "I wish Christianity is true." The New Testament part, he concedes that Yahweh is an evil character. But you're right. The only way he has that understanding, even though I think he was kind of raised Catholic, but it wasn't like what you and I went through.
Yes,
we have the full knowledge of, if that Jesus were true too, to the extent that the legend reports, this is not someone else you want to follow. Yes, there's some cool Stoic ideas mixed in there, and yes, there's some peaceful ideas sometimes kind of for some people randomly, but it's awful. It's truly terrible. That's hilarious to me, the idea of an atheist still being indoctrinated into Christianity being good. That's hilarious.
Well, the main one that people go to is they say, "Well, Jesus said, 'Love thy neighbor.'" And I'm like, that's just a horrible example, because Jesus is quoting Leviticus when he says that, and Leviticus is very clear that love thy neighbor is not inclusive. It is it is in the strictest form, those people that live among you. So this is literally love your neighbor and F everybody else, which is like a lot of Jesus's message, That's how I shall digress.
We could go all day for that, for sure. I mean, I always point, my personal example is Jesus and the Canaanite woman who calls a dog and almost kills her out of not even pity. I think it's almost, if you really read that story, it's almost like you've humored me, dog, you lesser than. You made an interesting quip, and for that, because it cost me nothing, I shall heal. Like, it's horrendous.
It's like the story of the Good Samaritan, right? What most people don't realize, that story, that's like me telling a story about the good Mexican.
Yeah.
That's
already wrong. Yeah. Crazy. Man. All right. Well, let's finish it up here. Number 10 is an interesting one, of course, as well. And it is back to the church more so than religion, than Christianity. Mm-hmm. The church needs you more than you need it.
I think this one circles back to the first one perfectly. The church is a business. And my biggest concern about the church being a business means it's a failing business. That means it's not actually building on its mission. It's not actually succeeding. It doesn't have a financially viable way of existing. It's not sustainable, which means if it has shareholders, it would have to be giving answers to this, right? So the little thing we slipped up on in this conversation is that churches, for the most part, operate like MLMs. MLMs need you more than you need them. They're not offering you a sustainable product. They're not offering you something that, again, going back to the illustration earlier about the trauma traps, if you have to keep coming here, then there's nothing I'm giving you that's helping. You know, at this moment, that means whatever you have, this is lifelong, you know. But the church needs you. It needs you because it is a failed business. And so it needs your money, it needs your attendance, it needs your loyalty. Now, again, for those of us on the outside looking in, that's obvious. But the implications of this are staggering. If the church needs you to survive, then it doesn't need God, doesn't need Jesus, doesn't need any of this extra stuff. And the real problem there is you're treated as if you can't survive with the church. You're coming to the church to get your weekly fill up.
Yeah.
When in all actuality, you're showing up at the church to give the church its weekly fill up.
Yes, man, that's so true. Whether you like the word or not, or it's too negatively connotated, or it's purposeful or not, it's manipulation at the end of the day. I was thinking of an analogy in my head just now. Can you imagine if a secular counselor like went up to a toddler's parents and was like, hey, I don't know your kid at all, but I know they're so messed up. They're completely broken. They're going to need to see me twice a week. Not for the next year, not during puberty, not to deal with this particular issue, forever. They need to see me.
Yep.
They're never going to arrive. Again, it's back to the never arrival. And some people can benefit, by the way, from like serious long-term counseling, and it's even good to have sounding boards, and there's all kinds of psychological things there. But if that was the mission statement, even forget the toddler example, if you were 30 and you had a particular issue and you went in to a counselor for maybe it's addiction recovery, whatever, and they said, okay, we are going to meet forever. Like, you would be like, then I'm not going to receive the help, because if I have to come forever, I'm not ever going to fully be relieved of this.
That's right.
And even the addiction example is bad because people call themselves addicts for life, and it's something you have to continually address. But you understand my point here.
Absolutely.
Like, it shouldn't be lifelong. It was so perfect the way you said it. I didn't need to add to it. Well, thank you so much. I know that last one was short, but I think, like you said, we covered it a lot. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your insight. You know, when you did the video, you started off with, you took time to think about these 10 seriously. This wasn't just you making a top tier list and knocking it out really quick for content. And I think as we've explored it and examined it, we can see the truth behind each and every one of these issues. So the goal, of course, is not to tear down the church. The goal is not to deconvert people, at least. And I think from hearing your mission, you would agree that it's more about meeting people where they're at. It's about, wow, Christian talk still stuck in my head, meeting people where they're at. But it's true. My goal, let me know how much you agree here, is for the person that is already doubting or deconstructing, like, they're going to be seeking out this information, and we can help normalize and provide a path that is more healthy than going alone, as opposed to knocking on someone's door to tell them what you believe is stupid and wrong. So I hope that is what came through from both of us in the conversation here. There are good pastors, there are good Christians, there are good churches, but there's a byproduct of harm within the religion, and we want people to be free of that. So I like to try, I'm starting to try to state the goals more for clarity, even though we've probably lost most people by this point. But again, thank you so much. Is there anything you kind of want to close with that you want to say here?
I just want to echo just what you just said there, that, you know, the goal for me, or at least I don't find it a fruitful endeavor to be out there trying to say, hey, Christians, you need to become like us. Hey, Christians, you need to come over here. I think the goal is, like you said, we need to be creating spaces where we can meet people where they are. I think, Dr. Anthony Penn was the first person I think heard said, we need to create soft spaces for people to land. It's the people who are deconstructing, the people who are doubting, the people who have never been religious that I'm really the most interested in. And I'm still invested in believers and what life looks like for them. But I don't want to be disrespectful of their lived experience and their journey and where they are now. So I don't want to go out to convert them. Instead, I want to build these safe places, establish them to make sure they're as healthy as I can for those people. And then I think what we'll see, I have a sneaky suspicion, is there will be a lot of people who are currently sitting on those pews, who are currently playing in the worship band, who are currently leading the youth ministries, who will breathe and say, oh, there's finally a place where I can just go do the things that I love doing for people, and I don't have to worry about these existential questions that I'm not even interested in anyway. Mm-hmm. I could actually just go somewhere and do life and do community. And if I decide that I don't want to do it next week, no one's going to be mad at me and tell me I'm going to go to hell. I think at that moment we'll start winning the war of attrition.
Yeah,
we'll see
that's
more
really
and more people come over.
It's a really good way of saying it, for sure, because it is my biggest fear. My last conversation here was with Britt Hartley, who runs a channel, No Nonsense Spirituality, and her entire focus is how terrible so far the atheist experiment, so to speak, is going in terms of providing what's next, or a replacement, if you will, for these very human needs that were met for a long time by religion as it evolved with us for a reason. If we deemed it's not true and it's harmful, then we have to provide. And so, again, it's stuck with me, and it's even why I wanted to speak with you, because of what you've done, because I think you're like-minded there. So, yeah, thank you very much, man. Thanks for being on. I'm sure we'll do more in the future.
Awesome. Thank you.
I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Alexander, Ann, Boris, Eric, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kiboga, Matthew, Perry, and Sean; my Humanist Heroes, James, Jared, Christy, Matthew, and Thronus; my Atheist Advocates, Caleb, David, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Julie, Malcolm, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas; as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel, or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.